The room was alive with the shimmer of diamonds, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the low hum of conversations filled with wealth and power. The gala was a sight to behold. Elegance draped in silk and gold, with chandeliers casting a warm glow over the city's elite. Among them was Victoria Langford, a woman who carried herself with the kind of confidence that only extreme wealth could buy. Dressed in a floor-length designer gown, she moved through the crowd like a queen surveying her kingdom, her red lips curving into a smirk as she sipped her champagne. At her side, carrying out her every whim, was Daniel, a tall, composed man, with deep brown skin and a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the arrogance of the guests around him. As her personal attendant, he was always there, always ready to serve, but rarely acknowledged. Victoria didn't see Daniel as anything more than a tool, a convenience in her well-manicured life. To her, he wasn't a man, just someone who fetched her drinks, adjusted her gown when it slipped from her shoulder, and stood silently as she laughed with people who barely knew his name. Tonight, the room was filled with the city's most influential figures, CEOs, politicians, celebrities. But Victoria was focused on one person in particular, Jonathan Pierce, a billionaire investor who had the power to open doors she had long been trying to walk through. This gala was her chance to impress him, to secure a deal that would cement her place at the very top of the social and financial hierarchy. And for that, she needed to put on a show of absolute perfection. She turned to Daniel, eyes scanning him with mild disdain. "Fix my dress, and for God's sake, don't stand so close to me. You're supposed to blend in, not ruin the aesthetic." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable as he stepped back. He had long learned that nothing he did would ever be enough for her, but he also knew something Victoria didn't. Tonight, the balance of power was about to shift in a way she could never have imagined. As the evening went on, Victoria was at her peak, laughing at the right moments, dazzling Jonathan with her charm. But in the midst of her performance, she couldn't resist one of her usual jabs at Daniel. With an exaggerated sigh, she waved her hand toward him and said, "You'd think after all these years, he'd at least learn to move a little faster, but I suppose you can't expect much." A few guests chuckled uncomfortably, shifting in their seats. Jonathan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Daniel, however, met Victoria's gaze for the first time that evening, a quiet confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because within moments, the entire room turned as the grand entrance doors swung open. The murmurs started softly, then grew into a collective gasp. Walking through the doorway, flanked by some of the most powerful figures in the city, was a man dressed in the kind of authority that couldn't be bought. His suit impeccably tailored, his presence commanding, and at his side, locked in an easy conversation, was none other than Jonathan Pierce himself. Victoria's breath caught in her throat, because the man who had just stolen the attention of the entire room, the man whose very presence had silenced the evening's most important deal, was none other than Daniel, but not the Daniel she had spent years ordering around. No, this Daniel was someone entirely different, someone she had never truly seen, and the look in his eyes as he turned toward her told her one thing. She was about to learn exactly who he really was. The air in the ballroom felt heavier now, thick with the weight of realization settling over Victoria. The same man she had spent years treating as invisible now stood before her, transformed, not as a servant, but as someone powerful, someone with influence. The same guests who had once ignored Daniel were now drawn to him, whispering amongst themselves, trying to piece together what they had missed. Victoria's fingers tightened around her champagne glass as she struggled to process what was happening. Her mind raced. How? How had Daniel, the man who had once stood quietly in the background, suddenly become the center of attention? And why was he standing beside Jonathan Pierce, the very man she had spent the entire evening trying to impress? Daniel, calm and poised, exchanged greetings with the guests, as if he had been in these circles his entire life. He moved with an ease that made it clear he belonged here. Victoria watched in stunned silence as Jonathan placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and said, "Now this is the man everyone in the city needs to meet. A true game changer." Her stomach twisted. Jonathan was supposed to be talking about her that way. She forced a smile and stepped forward, desperate to regain control. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying the same condescending tone she had always used, though there was an undeniable edge of uncertainty beneath it. "What an unexpected surprise!" Daniel turned to her, his eyes steady. There was no trace of the quiet obedience she was used to. Instead, there was something else, something unreadable, yet powerful. "Victoria," he said, his voice smooth but distant, as if addressing a mere acquaintance. "I see you're enjoying the evening." She let out a short, nervous laugh. "I should be asking you that question. It's not every day that someone like you walks into a room like this as a guest." For a moment there was silence. The words hung in the air, and a few nearby guests exchanged glances. Sensing the tension, Jonathan's eyes flickered between them, his expression unreadable. Daniel smiled, but it wasn't the polite, reserved smile she was used to. It was something sharper. "You're right," he said. "It's not every day. But things change." Victoria swallowed, her heart pounding now. She needed answers. Fast. She glanced around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening, and then she saw her. Across the room, standing beside another group of high-profile guests, was Eleanor Graves, a name Victoria knew all too well. Eleanor was one of the most influential businesswomen in the city, a force in finance and investments. Victoria had spent years trying to impress her, hoping to be noticed, and yet there Eleanor was, engaged in an animated conversation with Daniel, her laughter genuine, her body language open. It didn't make sense. None of this did. Unable to contain her frustration, Victoria turned back to Daniel. "I don't understand," she said, lowering her voice. "What are you doing here? And why are you—" She gestured toward Jonathan, toward Eleanor, toward the entire room that now seemed to revolve around him. "Why are they acting like you're one of them?" Daniel studied her for a moment before answering. "Because I am." The words were simple, but their impact hit Victoria like a slap. She let out a short, breathless laugh, shaking her head. "That's impossible. You've been working for me for years." Daniel tilted his head slightly, amused. "You never asked why." The room felt like it was closing in on her. All these years, she had assumed she knew everything about him, because she never bothered to look deeper. To her, he had always been just Daniel, the man who carried her coats and poured her drinks. She never questioned who he was beyond that, and now, standing in front of her, he was no longer just Daniel. He was someone far more powerful than she had ever imagined. "Let me help you understand," he said, stepping closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I wasn't working for you, Victoria. I was watching you." Her breath caught. "Watching me?" He nodded. "Studying, learning. You see, I was never just your servant. I was building something. You spent all these years believing you were above me, but while you were focused on climbing, I was building the foundation for something much bigger." Her mind reeled. You're lying. He smiled again. Am I? She wanted to argue, to tear him down, to remind him of his place. But as she looked around the room, the way people gravitated toward him, the respect in their eyes, she knew that whatever place she had assigned him in her mind was no longer real. Victoria clenched her jaw, her nails digging into her palm. What do you want, Daniel? He studied her for a moment, as if considering the question. Then, finally he said, Nothing, because for the first time, I don't need anything from you. And with that, he turned away, leaving her standing there, alone. Her world suddenly much smaller than it had been just moments before. Victoria stood frozen, her perfectly curated world cracking around her. Daniel had walked away, his presence still commanding attention from the wealthiest and most powerful people in the room. She had spent years dismissing him, seeing him as nothing more than an accessory to her success. And yet, tonight, she was the one standing in the background, watching him take center stage. She refused to accept it. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he had gotten lucky. Maybe this was all some elaborate stunt. But as she observed the way people gravitated toward him, the way Jonathan Pierce laughed at something he said, the way Eleanor Graves nodded in approval, it became clear that this wasn't luck. This wasn't a stunt. Daniel belonged here. Her chest tightened. She couldn't let this happen. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As she reached his side once more, Daniel, she said, keeping her voice light, as if the tension between them didn't exist. Why don't we talk somewhere private? I think we've had a misunderstanding. Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might humor her, give her one last chance to regain control. But then, he simply smiled and said, I don't think we have. The words stung more than she expected. Come on, she pressed, lowering her voice. You don't belong with these people. You and I both know that. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet disappointment. That's where you're wrong, Victoria, he said. The only person who doesn't belong here is someone who thinks like you. A flicker of something. Was it embarrassment? Was it anger? Flashed across her face. You think you're better than me now, she scoffed. But there was a desperate edge to her voice. Because you got a new suit? Because you shook hands with a few rich people? Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. It's not about the suit, Victoria. It's about value. Respect, something you never gave me, because you never thought I deserved it. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But the truth is, I never needed your approval. You just never realized how little you mattered in the bigger picture. Victoria's throat tightened. For the first time in a long time, she had no response, no clever comeback, no way to twist the situation in her favor. And then, the final blow came. Jonathan Pierce, the very man she had spent the evening trying to impress, turned to Daniel and said, We should head over to the lounge. Eleanor and I want to go over a few final details before we move forward. Victoria blinked. Move forward. Jonathan must have noticed her confusion, because he glanced at her briefly, before looking back at Daniel. You never told me you knew Victoria, he said, with mild amusement. Daniel smiled, though there was a knowing look in his eyes. She used to work for me. The words hit her like ice water. Jonathan laughed, assuming it was a joke, but Victoria knew better. He wasn't joking. He had meant every single word. As Daniel turned to leave with Jonathan and Eleanor, Victoria stood there, gripping her empty champagne glass, her mind reeling. Everything had changed. She had spent so many years looking down on him, and now he had risen above her, without her even realizing it was happening. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. And the worst part, there was nothing she could do about it. As Daniel walked away, disappearing into a world she had always believed was hers alone, Victoria was left standing in the middle of the glittering ballroom, silent, small, and utterly powerless.